Welcome to the Consumer Finance Podcast. I'm Chris Willis, the co-leader of Troutman Pepper's Consumer Financial Services Regulatory Practice, and I'm glad you've joined us today for a special announcement about a brand new podcast that several of my colleagues are launching called Payments Pros. This is a podcast that's being driven by three of my colleagues, Keith Barnett, Carlin McCrory, and Josh McBain, and I have all three of them on today to tell you about their new podcast. So Keith, Carlin, Josh, welcome to the Consumer Finance Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
So I'm really excited about the fact that you've launched this new podcast called Payments Pros, and it's going to be all about legal issues surrounding payments products and the payments industry. But Josh, let me start with you. Why did the three of you have the idea to start a podcast about this subject?
We're excited to launch a new podcast because we felt like there really isn't another podcast out there covering the ever-changing and dynamic payment space. Payments covers a lot of different topics, from money transmission to different ways to pay for goods and services. And it raises a host of different legal issues. And there's really no one covering this dynamic space. And we look forward to interviewing industry experts and talking to our internal experts about all of these interesting topics.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I'm so proud of the three of you for filling this vacuum in the podcast world, that there really isn't anything that talks about the payments regulatory issues that y'all will be addressing. And so, Keith, let me ask you to expand on that a little bit. What kind of subject matter should listeners expect when they tune in to the Payments Pros podcast?
We'll actually make it pretty interesting for the listeners. We're going to talk about federal laws, state laws, both federal and state enforcement actions, industry rules and updates. And as Josh mentioned, we're going to talk to industry leaders, including regulators, so we can know what they are thinking. That way people could just listen to our podcast and not have to go to another city or another state and try to figure out what it is that the regulators or industry leaders are thinking. But we also want to talk about innovations in payments and how those innovations relate to the overall payments ecosystem. And we're going to, since we're lawyers and we're nerdy lawyers and nerdy payments lawyers, we're going to try to fit in some law within that. So we're teaching at the same time. But the bottom line is people should tune in to our podcast for not only an overview of what's going out there legal wise, but also so they can hear about new cutting edge payments products.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And I know I'm going to be listening to every episode as you all release it. And for our listeners here, Carlin, would you mind telling them if they're interested in listening in to Payments Pros, where can they find it? How can they listen in?
Yeah, we'd love for the audience here to subscribe to the Payments Pros either through Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you typically get your podcasts, and tune in to all the insightful topics we have.
Well, let me also add that I'm pretty sure that when you post episodes, they're going to be featured on both of our blogs, TroutmanPepperFinancialServices.com and ConsumerFinancialServicesLawMonitor.com. And your podcast will also be available in our Troutman Pepper Financial Services mobile app, which is available both in the Apple App Store as well as the Google one. Just search for Troutman Pepper, and all of our podcasts, including your new one, Payments Pros, will be featured there, and you can listen to them right in the app with all the functionality of a podcast player. Keith, Carlin, Josh, thanks very much for joining me on the podcast today. And to our listeners, thanks for listening in today. And please head on over to Payments Pros and give it a listen. I'm sure you're going to be interested. Thank you all for listening.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.